thank you, Steve, for doing this for our Jewish community. When I say our Jewish community, we don't define ourselves by borders. We have people from different European cities, but most of the people are coming from Serbia or ex-Yugoslavia. And Nada, our great teacher, said we want Steve. So Nada, here is you can see soon. You will see him in a full screen. So Steve, please. Please, the floor is yours. I would just like to congratulate you and Dina as well for becoming a grandparents. It's a exciting moment in life. So Mazal Tov and all the best for your family.
My great pleasure. Okay, so I am obviously Steve. Just 2 sentences on myself. I'm speaking in English, and I don't know whether you are sensitive to accents, but I speak good English. And the reason I speak good English, real English, is because I'm originally from England. And it's very frustrating in Israel because anyone who has some kind of an English accent is always thought to be American. So we Anglos get very annoyed by the thing, and you're hearing the real thing. Okay, so I'm delighted that Mina and Sonia asked me to speak about something I love very much, which is modern Jewish literature. And as Sonia said, this is really an introduction to the whole question of really the creation of modern Jewish literature, what it means, where it comes from, etc., etc. Then you'll get tomorrow with Zsuzsa, and then 2 days' time with Maya, you'll be getting obviously much more specific. So I'm taking the subject of the overview. Okay, so let me say. Oh, I wanted to say one other thing, which is that I said I'm from England. I came to Israel about over 40 years ago. And I live in Jerusalem with Dina, my wife, who is sitting next to me. So she's helping me with some technical things. So if you see a hand suddenly coming into the picture, which is not mine, I hope it's hers. You know, we're here with our family, etc., etc., etc. And indeed, you know, I spent many, many years being a Jewish educator, which is one of the great professions, at least for me. Partly, perhaps I don't know whether I can do anything else, but the great thing is when you love something, as I love the subjects that I've had the luck to teach, it's just great because you know you can be. I always say I've got the best stuff to teach. So even if I do a reasonable job but not a great job, the stuff is so interesting, whatever it is, that you know, something has to get through. Okay, so I want to start by telling you the following very brief anecdote. A week ago, it was here in Israel. It was Holocaust Day, Yom HaShoah, and I happened to be sitting in a small group. Doesn't matter what the context is, but we were listening to a presentation about from someone who was talking about cinema and the Holocaust. Okay, and the person opened up by saying, "Well, you tell me, everybody, what's cinema?" And we're like, "What's cinema? That's a very funny question." I'm like, you know, everyone's a bit embarrassed. And what's cinema? I mean, what are you going to say? And he waited and he said, "Well, I'm not going to start until you tell me what cinema is." So then this one says this and this one says this, etc. And he puts it together. So for me, it was interesting being a participant in a group like that, because it's like someone asks a question, you don't have the faintest idea how to answer. You don't know what that person is looking for, what's right, what's wrong, etc., etc. And it's it was an interesting experience being on the other end, because I'm usually the one who asks the questions, and I'm going to ask a question here and there tonight. So please don't be embarrassed. I have reasons for asking the questions. Whether they're too general or they're too specific, you'll decide, but questions are important. We've just finished Pesach, and questions are one of the most important themes of what actually happens on the night of Seder. So with questions on our mind, I'm going to ask you the first one. You know that, I presume, you know the subject. After that loop that was going around at the beginning, I presume you know what we're here for. We're here for modern Jewish literature. And I want to ask you, I want everyone to think for a moment how much they know about, or how much you think you know about modern Jewish literature. If you know a lot, do this. If you know a little, do that. If you don't do anything, take your hands out of the picture. If you don't know anything, take your hands out of the picture. This is a serious question. Don't be modest, don't be shy. Really reflect for a second for yourself. Do I know this? Do I know this? Do I know that? Etc., etc. And then we'll start taking it forward. So think for a second, and then simply put yourselves on screen. And I can't see the whole screen. I can only see like 5 faces. Why is that? Wait. I need to see all the. No. If you go into view. I can't see. 1 second. Keep your hand. Okay. I don't know what your custom is. I'd love to see faces, if possible. So the people who are like, I don't know what you're doing while your screen is black, if you're washing your whatever, but it would be great, if possible, unless it's too traumatic, it would be lovely to see faces.
Steve, there are a few answers in the chat. One person said very little. Mm-hmm. Another person said less than a little.
Okay, less than a little. Okay,
yes.
All right. And so generally speaking, I'm understanding, generally not a lot. And perhaps for some of you, nothing, which is fine. As you know, that's just a product of what our background is, what we've come across, what we've read, or what we've learned, or what we haven't had the opportunity to learn, what we've never opened up a book to read, etc., etc., etc. So it's fine to say nothing. I just don't know anything about it. But I'm going to press a little bit, and I'm going to ask people to think for a moment, think for a minute. Oh, let's put that first slide on. Wait a sec. 1 second. Right. So I want you to think, what do you think modern Jewish literature is? You might be wrong, you might be right, you might be wrong. And I want you to suggest in a sentence or a phrase, anything that you think might be relevant to the question of modern Jewish literature. It can be the when, the what, whatever it is, anything that you think is relevant to the question of what is modern Jewish literature. Take a minute, and please, please, please don't be shy. We're limited in time, so you have no time to be shy. Okay, you should, get right in and be embarrassed from the beginning, but speak while you're embarrassed. Okay, so that's the question. Let's take that down. Stop share. Okay. So
sorry.
Okay. So anyone who's going to be the first person to actually cross the sea, throw themselves into the sea so the sea opens? That's a Pesach reference. Any suggestions? Yeah, anyone who wants to talk, please unmute.
Yes, I unmute myself. Yeah. Yeah, hello, Steve.
Hi.
Hi. I believe this is a trick question. I don't know what is Jewish literature. Is it written by Jews, or it is written in Hebrew, or maybe it is written by other authors in some other languages about the past, about the contemporary? Sonia, please help me. Or about future?
Nobody needs to help you. You're doing great.
Contemporary, this is a very difficult word in English, you know, contemporary, yeah. And in life, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think this is young authors from Israel and from other countries dealing with topic about Jewish life.
Great. That's a great, great opening statement. That could be the first 10 minutes of what we're going to do. Those questions that you asked. And we will indeed come to them. You know, what on earth are we talking about? Is it in Hebrew? Is it not in Hebrew? Young writers, not young writers, by Jews, about Jews. That's exactly, those are exactly some of the major questions. Thank you so much. Anybody else?
Zoran in the chat wrote that creating new world. Maybe Zoran, you can explain a little bit more what you meant by that, if you want.
Zoran, you'll have to unmute. No? Yeah.
No, I don't need to explain that. I think it's enough, those words.
Okay. All right. Fine. Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Zhuzha wrote in the chat, the thoughts and feelings of the Jewish experience. So that's what makes a modern Jewish literature.
Okay. All right. The thoughts, okay, of the Jewish experience. When? No, you're muted. You're muted.
Modern times.
In modern times, right. That's a very important addition.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Of course, there is a question what that means when we're talking about when did modern times start, but we'll get there. Anybody else? Yeah.
Okay, Mrs. Kasper, hello. Nice to hear, your introduction. So I would say that, as far as I know about Jewish literature, it means something like a bridge. As far as the Israeli writers are concerned, it seems to me that they write about some, they carry their experiences, as Zhuzha said, from before, but coming into a new country, and then, it's like a melting pot, something happens there, and so on. So we get like a new entrance into a new world, but carrying with them the past, let's say.
Okay.
Something like that. It's like a bridge.
Okay, between the past and
the new, yes.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, so perhaps the first thing that I should do is deal with the question of modern. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about modern Jewish literature? What's the modern bit? And when does the modern bit start? When does the whole question of, when do you talk about Jewish literature, and when do you talk about modern Jewish literature? So let's talk about time. But just before we do, let's talk about what there was before modern. There's an enormous Jewish literature going back thousands of years before we get to the question of modern. So let's have a look at it. Some of this will be familiar. Next one. Hold on. Okay, so this is stuff that many of you will be familiar with. I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes on it, but it's just good to understand how much literature there was among the Jews before we get to modern, whenever that is. So I imagine that many of you have heard the description of the Jews as the people of the book. It's one of the familiar phrases that was used about the Jews, one of the more complimentary familiar phrases that was used about the Jews. It comes from a non-Jewish perspective. The Jews, not the person who said it, the Jews are the people of the book. And it was always seen as something that was positive. Now, when the idea was first created, the Jews are the people of the book, so they were talking about the first two lines here. So there's the Torah, right? So-called 5 books of Moses, which is part of the Tanakh, the Bible as a whole. And those are the 2 lines which got the reputation for the Jews of being the people of the book. And I imagine most of you are familiar at least with those. But Jewish literature from that basis continues to grow and develop through a good 1500 years before we get to the modern. So there's what we call rabbinic literature. Rabbinic literature is the literature that comes from the group that we call the rabbis in Jewish history. And without going into any detail about who the rabbis exactly are, we'll say that it is a group that comes to prominence, that comes to leadership in the generations after the destruction of the Second Temple. And they were great talkers, they were great learners, and they were great at writing down what they talked about and what they taught. So the great collection is called the Talmud. That has itself a couple of different parts. We won't go into it now. And then there are the stories that they told, mostly developing ideas from the Torah and sometimes from the other books in the Bible. And those stories have been collected, and we call that Midrash. Okay. Then there are all the books of prayer. Any of you who have been to Bet Knesset, to a synagogue, will perhaps have come across the Siddurim. The Siddur is the basic prayer book, and there's many different versions of that. Or on certain festivals, we have other books that are called the Machzorim. So that's everything to do with prayer. And then, because Judaism really from the very, very early days was a way of life which was developed around rules for well over 1500 years, we have what are called books of halakha. Halakha is the Jewish law or the Jewish way of life. And there were books that told Jews, this is what you need to do. And those are what we call here, I call them the codes of halakha, the books that collect all the things that Jews have to do and tell whichever generation it is, this is what you need to do now. Then there were other things. For example, in Spain, in the Middle Ages, there was a great flourishing of actually 2 types of literature. One is the one I've written here, which is Hebrew poetry, which was extraordinary, the Hebrew poetry that developed in Spain. And then again, some of the same people who wrote poetry and some of the people that didn't also wrote philosophy, either in Hebrew or in Arabic. And at the same time, partly in Spain and partly in other places, in the Middle Ages, we get the development of the kind of mystical Judaism that has come to be called the Kabbalah. And when we get to the 18th century, in Eastern Europe, the Kabbalah takes a new form, and we get a popular movement of Chassidut, which I imagine that you are aware of. And Chassidut also created its own literature. Now, all of these things were there and had been developing over, let's say, almost 3,000 years. The Torah, there's different views of whether the Torah was given at one moment on Sinai or it was developed over time. We won't get into that question. But even according to the historians who think the Torah developed over time and was not given at one moment by God to Moses, which is what the tradition states, the historians believe that the earliest parts of the Torah are at least 1,000 years before zero. And so the Torah, the earliest parts of our Jewish literature, as we go back now, is around 3,000 years, okay? And all the others developed over time, reflecting usually a specific period of time in which they were written. And as a result of that, when we get to the modern period, we're going to get to what the modern period actually means. When we get there, we already have incredibly large bookshelves, which are full of all sorts of books, which I am going to call, I'm going to use the word now, I'm going to call them traditional. In other words, there are probably thousands, certainly many, many, many hundreds of different books which have been written over time, which reflect what we can call traditional Jewish literature, which is literature that came out of the belief system of the Jews, and was very multidimensional. It had many different aspects to it. Now, one thing I haven't written here, and I want to add it because it's important, is there's one particular part of Jewish literature, which is pre-modern, which doesn't go on this traditional list. This is a list of traditional Jewish literature. The one kind of Jewish literature which existed at the same time as many of these, but wasn't traditional in the sense of being part of the rabbinic agenda, is the Jewish folk story. And just like in every other country, there is a folk tradition which isn't necessarily under the control of the people who decide what culture should look like. So in the Jewish tradition, there were also hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of folk stories of all sorts of different kinds, which reflected different aspects of Jewish life at different times. So we really have to add here, underneath Hasidic literature, the folk story, the Jewish folk story. So all of that existed for a long, 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 long time until we get to modern structure. Until we get to modern. So the question is, when does modern Jewish literature start? And the answer is connected with the wider question, which is not a Jewish question: when does the modern world start? And most historians will answer that, at great length, by the way, will answer that by saying somewhere between the late 18th century and the early 19th century. In those generations, to a very large extent, that's when modern history starts. And just a few years later, that's when modern Jewish history starts. And one of the products of that modern Jewish history is indeed literature. Now let's talk about that a little more specifically. It's funny to think perhaps of literature as an ideological expression. We normally think about it as authors who feel they have something to say and they want to be successful and they write a book, etc., etc. But when we look at a subject as complicated as modern Jewish literature, we have to see it through glasses which are ideological. because it starts from an ideological movement. And the movement is a movement which created ideologically the modern Jewish world, is the movement that we call the Haskalah. And the Haskalah is firstly, the word Haskalah. The word Haskalah is more or less the equivalent of the English word, the Enlightenment. You know, some of you will know the word the Enlightenment, meaning the ideological movement which developed in Europe in the 18th century into the 19th century and took what we would call modernity and changed towards modernity as a positive value. That's the Enlightenment. The Haskalah is the Jewish movement which does exactly the same. Okay? Haskalah comes from the word sechel. Sechel means reason or mind. And the Haskalah is the movement for applying rational thought and critiquing the world, the Jewish world, which existed at the time. So what happens, what happens is in Europe as a whole, we have the movement that is called the Enlightenment, starting, let's say, the mid-18th century. And about 20 years after the Enlightenment, we get the beginning of the Jewish movement for enlightenment, which is called the Haskalah. So the Haskalah, let's say 1770s, 1780s, and onwards. Now, the problem is, both in terms of the general enlightenment and in terms of the Haskalah, that they don't happen in every place at the same time. Okay? Those of you who know the Enlightenment know that the Enlightenment starts in Western Europe, especially in France, the area of France, the area of Germany, the area of England, the area of Italy. That's really the beginning of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment tends to go, firstly, within Europe, from west to east. And then out of Europe, it starts to affect other places. But it takes, the Enlightenment in general, takes several generations to make an impact from west to east. Exactly the same thing happens with the Haskalah. The Haskalah, the Jewish movement for enlightenment, develops in Western Europe, 1770s, 1780s, and then it slowly goes forward, going on the whole from west to east. So if we say that the Enlightenment begins in the biggest Jewish community in the West, which was Germany at that point, there it starts in the late 18th century until it really starts to get to the biggest Jewish community in the world at that time, which was in Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland. We're in the late 19th century. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a movement that rolls. It rolls eastwards from west to east. And it takes several generations to develop the impetus to take people with it. It starts with intellectuals, some of the intellectuals in the Jewish world, or new intellectuals. And slowly it starts to get deeper among the middle classes and then even to other classes as well. But it takes time. And it means that, for example, in Germany, in the German lands, it wasn't called Germany at the time, but in the German lands, in about 1820, almost every Jew there had in one way or another been affected by the ideas of Haskalah. But at that same time, let's say 1820, there were like 3.5 individuals in Russia, in Jewish Russia, who'd been affected by the Haskalah. And only around 60, 70, 80 years later, do we start talking about larger groups in Russia and Eastern Europe. Okay? Am I clear so far? About how many people have I lost? Have I lost you? Are you okay? Yeah? Okay. So yes. No. Are you there? Anyone who wants to come in with a question, please do. I just talk forever, so, but you have to shut me up. Anybody? Okay. So, another thing to say, which is important, is that almost all of the early Maskilim were religious. Some were extremely religious, but they were opening up to a new worldview. Many of them stayed religious till their death, but they were opening up and believing that Jewish life needed to change. Jewish life needed to modernize. They saw that modernization was happening in the world around. The world around the Jews was changing. They believed, we might not be so sure now, but they believed that on the whole, the world, the non-Jewish world, was opening up to the possibility of tolerance for Jews if the Jews were to change their way of life and become more open. So that was the idea of the Maskilim. Let's change Jewish life, not necessarily to make it non-religious, but to open it up so that we become modern Jews, not just a copy of who our parents were, our grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., etc. We need to change. And in order to understand why that's so important, you have to understand that the Jewish cultural elite, the Jewish leadership up to that time, had believed in general that change was bad, change was dangerous, change could undermine and threaten traditional Jewish life. So the general position was, we don't want to change too much. Maybe a little bit here or maybe a little bit there, but change is bad for the Jews. And the outside world is bad for the Jews. We don't want the outside world to come into our way of life and change it. So when these intellectuals started arguing for the philosophy of Haskalah, we need to change the Jewish world, and we need to change many things in the Jewish world. We need to start moving the Jewish world forward into a new reality. That was a major challenge to the leaders. And it means that for the first time, really, in a long, long, long time, there develops the beginning of a serious challenge to the traditional leadership. People who want a different kind of Jewish life and who say, we don't believe that all the wisdom is always in the books, the holy books, and the rabbis who are the interpreters of those holy books. We don't believe that we need totally to live our lives according to what that traditional bookshelf has been telling us for hundreds and hundreds of years. The time has come to change. Now, the Haskalah had an opinion on almost everything. And one of the things that they believed needed to develop and to change is language and literature. And the importance of literature in the Haskalah is very, very important. And I'll explain in a moment, but I just want to underline. If the Haskalah was the movement for creating a modern Jewish world, the ideological movement creating the modern Jewish world, one of the things that they talked about an enormous amount is creating a new kind of literature. Okay, now, what should that literature be? Let's start from the question of language. What language should Jews speak? And what language should Jews read? And what language should Jews know? So just in a couple of sentences, up to now, the elite had good knowledge, the elite males, the men, had good knowledge of Hebrew as a written language, not a very good knowledge of Hebrew as a spoken language. They saw it as a literary language. And almost throughout almost the whole Jewish world, languages had developed which mixed the language of the dominant language of the place where Jews were at any time, and Hebrew into a kind of a dialect, which was a Jewish version of whatever the language was in the area. So in Middle Europe, of course, we get Yiddish. And what's Yiddish? From about the 11th, 12th century, Yiddish is a Jewish version of medieval German. From about the 14th, 15th century, we get the development of Ladino as the spoken language of Jews, especially those Jews who left Spain after the exile from Spain and kept their language, their Spanish Jewish language up. In Arab countries, Jews spoke different kinds of Judeo-Arabic dialects, depending on where they were. If you were in Yemen, you'd speak one version. If you were in Morocco, you'd speak another version. And all around the Jewish world, Jews are speaking with each other in some kind of a language which was a Jewish version of the local language. If Jews from, let's say, Europe met Jews from, let's say, Yemen, how would they speak? They would speak in Hebrew. They'd speak Hebrew with each other. Not necessarily a very developed conversation, but that would be the common language. But Hebrew was not a spoken language at that time. It had been, of course, but it was no longer a spoken language. As the Haskalah developed, and they talked about what languages should Jews know. So the first thing they said is, Jews need to know the language of the land in which they live properly. Not a Jewish version of, but if we live in Germany, we Jews need to know German, as well as the Germans. It needs to be our everyday language. And then there were other Muslim who said, okay, that's fine. If you're in Germany, you speak German. If you're in Russia, speak Russian. But there are also educated languages that all educated people, all educated Jews should learn to speak. So the question of what the educated language is a very big subject. I just learned, I was recently reading War and Peace, and I discovered that the elite in Russia, not Jews, the elite in Russia in the first part of the 19th century spoke French. Everybody speaks French with each other, right? So why? Because French was at that time the educated language. So here Russians speak French with each other, not just when they meet French people. That's their language of communication, the elite, with each other. It's extraordinary. Many people would say that today English has had that, has taken that place. Maybe yes, maybe no. But the idea certainly was that educated Jews needed to know educated languages in order to be an educated person, okay? But what about an educated Jew? So here, the Maskilim said, the language which we need to know as Jews is our great traditional language, which is Hebrew. And we need to know it not to speak it, but we need to know it because it's our cultural language. We need to understand it. We need to understand our texts. We need to understand our tradition. And you can't do that, they said, unless you learn to understand Hebrew. So not as an active language necessarily, but more as a passive language, which all Jews should learn. Now, remember I said the Haskalah develops in Germany, in the German lands. And one of the things that the Maskilim are the people who believed in Haskalah, but one of the things the Maskilim very strongly believed was that the worst language in the world was the language that they'd all grown up in, which was Yiddish. Now, why was Yiddish such a bad idea from their point of view? They saw it as a bastardization of a language, meaning it wasn't a real language. It was a bit of German, a bit of Hebrew, a bit of Slavic, a bit of Old French, a bit of this and a bit of that. And they said, it reflects the fact that we've been wandering around from place to place, picking up these words and those words, and it's bad. It's bad. We want modern Jews to be able to present themselves as whole people, not people who have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a kind of a rag bag of language. We want to speak pure languages, or we want to know pure languages. So we will speak the language of the land, we will speak other educated languages, and we will know how to read and to understand the Hebrew language, but no Yiddish, please. And that was a really important thing for the early Haskalah. Now, as we'll see, it's going to change. Let's close and we'll go on 3 or 4. I want to go to, oh, just leave it for a second. Okay, so yes, sure.
Okay, just a second, please. Sorry if I interrupt you. But I think that my question would fit now the best, so that's why I did it. Here, I mean, in Serbia, in Belgrade, we do have one great Jewish writer called Filip David, which I love a lot. And once when he was asked about if he belongs to, if his literature, I mean, belongs to Yugoslavian, Serbian, Jewish, you know, he's very funny. I like him a lot. And then his explanation was so intelligent. Since you know that we used to be Yugoslavia, so that country doesn't exist anymore. And when they wanted to make a new list in Serbia, talking about Serbian literature, then Filip David, as well as Danilo Kiš, his friend, okay, again, great writer of Jewish writer, they were in a problem. I mean, that was how Filip David said. And he said, I don't belong, I mean, now we're going to be anywhere. What does it mean, Jewish? There is no country we were the writer for. Now Serbian, I mean, we're nowhere actually. So this categorization is not clear. So now you were talking about Jewish, and you said Yiddish. I mean, I was thinking about Singer, the same thing. Imre Kertész, Hungarian Nobel Prize. I mean, is it Jewish? I mean, are they Jewish writers? So Filip David said that it's not okay to say. I mean, and from the other side, he said for this Haskalah that they insisted on language in the country they were, the Jews were living in. Okay, so, and this is also the attitude of Filip David. So just if you can say a little bit about that, because what it means, Jewish literature.
Okay, so
Thank
so
you.
that's one of the biggest questions of all, of course. What do we mean by Jewish literature?
Yeah.
Up to this point, up to the point that we've been speaking about, up to the Haskalah, it's very clear. Jewish literature is that traditional bookshelf that has been part of let's call it the rabbinic world, the rabbinic agenda. And it's very clear what belongs on it and what doesn't, right? It was all written by Jews. It was all written, it was almost all written actually, not completely, in what we would recognize as Jewish languages. It's a Hebrew bookshelf, principally. And it's very clear. Once you get to the modern world, of course, it becomes more complicated. So let's talk. I promise you that I will answer your question, but I need just to connect it to the development. We'll see. We're going to move on and go forward. Right, not there. Wait, we're just going through a text that we're not going to use. I'm going to talk about what Jewish writers actually wrote in the modern world as a result of the Haskalah. But I have to tell you that all the Jewish writers that are important, that are known up to the early to mid 20th century, 99% of them are men. And I want to say a word about that. Because the question is, what about women? Because we're talking about a movement that was basically developed by men, to a large extent for men. And the writers that wrote down whatever it was that they wrote were almost completely men. So were there any women writers? And the answer is there were. In the 19th century, there were some significant books and stories and poems that were written by women, but very few of them were published. And all those women who did write in the early generations were exceptional women, not just because they actually started to write, but they needed to have the background to write. They needed to come from families of maskilim, like their parents had started to be involved with Haskalah, therefore the children had had a good education, therefore the daughters as well as the sons could write. Or they needed to come from very enlightened rabbinic families. And there weren't so many, there were some. So women's literature from the 18th and mostly the 19th century has really emerged and has been printed and has been published in the mid 20th century. So there are women writers, and they're significant, but they become more and more frequent as we go from generation to generation, until now, today, I would say over half of the writers writing today on Jewish subjects, Jews writing about Jewish subjects, are women, without any question. But we're going to talk here about men. Okay, so